All right, so what I propose to do now is go back to my Joseph Campbell project. A couple of years ago, I did a chapter by chapter on his book, The Masks of God, Primitive Mythology. And then I got sidetracked by other projects as usual. Now, what I want to do is go through Oriental mythology, chapter by chapter, and then hopefully move on to Occidental and creative mythology. A couple things on the agenda first. Thank you for the Patreon subscribers. There were 14 new ones, not as much as I'd hoped for, but I appreciate all of you. You guys are all really great. You're all really nice to me, and I really appreciated your comments. So there's that. I have plans to create a Google live stream course that you can pay for if you want to participate, and the Patreons will be available. So it can be either or. If you don't want to subscribe to the Patreon, then you can pay for the course. And we'll see what the course is going to be. I've got a couple of ideas in mind, but we'll do it like every Saturday for 6 or 8 weeks. And it'll be live streamed on Google with private links, so only the people who pay can see. And that way, you guys can participate. You can talk, ask questions, make clarifications. So it'll be a much more fun process, and I think something worth paying for. The other thing I want to mention is that I am now doing astrology readings for anyone who's interested. Just hit me up at my Gmail, johndavidebert@gmail.com, and we'll do an astrology reading. So far, I've had about 10 customers, and it's really fun. I really enjoy it, and the people always get a lot out of it. They walk away every time with smiles on their faces. So all that is okay. So that's agenda out of the way. Now let's turn to Oriental mythology. This was the second book of his series on the history of human religiosity. This was published in 1962, and I can't remember for sure, but I think Primitive Mythology was 1959, 58 or 59, and then Occidental in the mid-60s, and then finally Creative Mythology, which I think is the greatest of all of these, was published in 1968. So this was a 10-year magnum opus of Campbell's that he wrote after he got back in 1953, I believe it was, 53, 54, from India, which was a big disappointment to him. He'd gone as a pupil of Heinrich Zimmer, the great Indologist Heinrich Zimmer, who probably knew more about all things Indian than Ananda K. Coomaraswamy, of whom Zimmer said, he's the only guy who gives me an inferiority complex about India. But nonetheless, I think that Coomaraswamy is very difficult to read, overloaded with footnotes, and extremely dull and boring. Heinrich Zimmer, on the other hand, is lively, and I think that Campbell's lively style is a direct inheritance of that. Even Young recognized that when Campbell sent to Young a copy of The Hero with a Thousand Faces. He wrote back, "You're coming along just fine under your mentor, Heinrich Zimmer." He recognized the similarity of the style, and so this was the 10-year magnum opus that he wrote after coming back from India and Japan. He loved Japan. He thought the Japanese had their act together. He loved their whole idea of life as a work of art. Everything you do matters. How you drink your tea, how beautiful the food looks, how beautiful the women are, how beautiful the men are. I mean, everything in Japan is based on beauty, form, elegance, harmony. Whereas India, I don't really want to say anything bad about it because I think that it has the world's most profound spiritual traditions. According to Campbell and his impressions, it's pretty slovenly. There's a carelessness about things there. But it follows from their metaphysics, which we'll get into here. Right from the start, he contrasts, it's part one is called The Separation of East and West. And chapter 1, The Signatures of the Four Great Domains. And this is a really brilliant concept. I think you're going to like this. And it's subtitled the dialogue in myth of East and West. And he starts off by mentioning this whole penchant for human sacrifice, especially in India, that went on in India, but India inherited it from the subtropical zones going across equatorial Africa. It's a jungle mythology, or at least agrarian, going all the way across into the Pacific, into the Polynesian world, where we find myths like, for example, the girl who is bathing and an eel comes up to her because there's no snakes. So you have to substitute an eel for that semiotic vacancy, who comes up to her and he's her lover. So she goes to this pool. I guess they have sex for a while. And then one day he says, cut my hat off and plant it. She's like, what are you talking about? He's like, just trust me. You'll like the result. So she does this, cuts his hat off and plants it in the ground. And from out of it, the first palm tree grows up. And you can see the god's face in the actual coconuts. And the coconut is a food staple. So that's one variant of this myth that you find spread everywhere in India as well, of this primordial time, a peaceful time that was interrupted by a murder or a sacrifice, and that individual had to be consumed cannibalistically in a meal. But we consume it through our food. The idea is that the god has sacrificed him or herself in order to give us food. And so it's an agrarian myth. And it goes way, way back. So he says, the British outlawed this. One of the positive things, I suppose, that the British did. They did a few positive things in setting up an empire in India, one of which was to make all the texts available, get everything written down under Sir William Jones. They got everything written down. So now we have this treasure trove of Indian literature that the West still hasn't fully absorbed, and an end to human sacrifice. They were sacrificing left and right. They had a tradition of offering a young boy every Friday to a specific goddess, chopped his head off, consumed the body. The yogis ate the lungs. Terrible, terrible stuff. They're really, talk about Nietzsche's opposition between Apollo and Dionysus. The dark Dionysian side of India is very dark. But they don't do that anymore. So now at the Durga Puja, for example, they sacrifice a bunch of goats and offer the blood of goats. In this myth, blood is the thing that makes the crops grow. It's essential in Aztec civilization, for example, and Mayan. Anything you want to make happen requires blood. It's the oil, the fuel that runs the civilization. Like, say you want to talk to one of your dead ancestors, you have to take an obsidian blade and cut your penis, or you take a long string with thorns on it and you put it up one nostril and draw it through the other, as is shown a princess is doing from a beautiful carving from Yaxchilan at the classic height of Mayan civilization. And then the result is an ancestor being will show up in the form of a serpent. So the serpent being will then open its jaws and out pops the ancestor being. Yeah, what can I do for you? I like the easier version of talking to the dead nowadays. I just pick up a phone. I just pick up a phone. I don't have to cut my dick or anything like that. So I think there's been some advance there in communicating with the dead. All right, so that's the opening, and then he focuses then on this myth, the shared myth of the one that became two, because all of these four domains, and the four domains are going to be China and India, the Levant, which is an outdated word for the Near East, and the West. Each one of them has this myth of the one that became two. He contrasts, by the way, this is Zoroaster. He contrasts this idea of the Indian idea of everything wanting to go back and fuse into that primordial one, that being that split itself into mitotically through a cosmic mitotic process, It felt fear because it was alone, so it split in two, into a male half and a female half. And I believe that was in the illustration here on the cover. That being in the center is the primordial androgyne that then decides to split itself mitotically in half into a male and a female. And they start fucking, and then they reproduce all the human beings. She changes into a cow, he changes into a bull, and so on, down to the ants. And then finally the being realizes, I am all this. I am everything. So that is the Indian idea of cosmic oneness. Everything is connected with everything else. Everything is God. Everything is divine. Whereas he says that the Zoroastrians were the first to make a separation. Not identity, but relationship becomes the idea with the Zoroastrians. Ahura Mazda versus Angra Mainyu. And Angra Mainyu may be the prototype as the god of darkness for Satan. And in between are human beings who have to work. They have to work towards a restoration of that original light that fell into darkness. And that's what we're doing. That's the cosmic goal. We're working. So notice that the God is separate from the beings. Total separation. It's not identification. It's based on a relationship in the West. And the West has inherited this. The Hebrews were taken captive by the Babylonians, and then the Achaemenids, under Cyrus the Great, restored them back to their homeland at around 500 BC, and then proceeded to try to attack the Greeks, and it didn't work. Two different cultural ideas, two different collisions. But nonetheless, the Zoroastrians represent this idea of relationship between man and God. Not the Indian idea of identity between my Atman and the Brahmatman. If you watch my Aurobindo videos, you know exactly what we're talking about here. All right, but each of these civilizations has this myth of the one who became two. And in our Bible, we find, of course, Adam was the original androgyne, and God, as a separate being, just like with Zoroastrianism, pulls the rib out, and she becomes Eve. And that rib wound, by the way, is restored with Christ on the cross when Longinus plunges a spear into his side, and it creates a vaginal wound that is intentionally vaginal because it makes Christ beyond pairs of opposites, and it restores him as the new Adam back to the old androgynous Adam. But the point that Campbell wants to make here is the separation between the God and the androgyne. So let's see what else he does here. So he starts talking about Buddhism, and he says, let's consider the basic myth of the Buddha then. So the Buddha has gone through all these difficult ordeals, Sankhya philosophy. He's tried Jainism with starving himself to death. A girl gives him a bowl of rice. That doesn't work, so he decides to eat. The way to enlightenment isn't to starve yourself. So he's looking for enlightenment, basically samadhi. And so he walks around this world tree, the Bodhi tree, and he goes on the north side, he goes on the west side, and the south side. And each time he goes on one of these sides, the world tilts. So it's out of balance until he gets on the east side. Once he finds the east side, then he sits down in perfect meditatory posture. He's depicted on a lotus there. The lotus is the cosmic vagina, by the way, in Indian mythology. And so he sits there and he waits. And then, of course, the god of Mara shows up. And Kama, Mara, and Artha are the three primary motivations. They're called the Trivarga, the primary human motivations in India. And first he tries Kama. Oh, let's show him these three beautiful porn stars. That'll move him toward desire. And their names are desire, fulfillment, regret, which means future, present, past. He's completely unmoved. He's in the state of nirvana. You can't touch him. You can't move him. He has extinguished his eye. his sense of ahang, the I. And if you extinguish the subject, there is no object. If you extinguish the self, there is no other. This is one of the problems I have with Buddhism, but we'll get to that another time. And then he sends an army now of fear, of demons. This is Arta, and doesn't move him at all. He's not scared at all. Horror movies, let's say, don't bother him. So then finally he appeals to Dharma, his duty, because Dharma is what controls the other two in Indian society, and he's unmoved by that. He says, well, you're a noble prince. Why aren't you out there doing your duties as a prince? He's immovable. He's attained nirvana, which means blown out. It means blowing out a wind or a candle flame. He's blown out. There is no self there, so there's no self to be moved. And then he simply touches the earth touching mudra, who justifies his right to be there through numerous incarnations that he's earned this karma from, and in this one that he has struggled his way to through enlightenment. So Campbell goes over that myth, and he says, because then he's going to contrast the mentality, the sensibility of that with China. And he wants you to think of the origins of yoga in the sutras of Patanjali. The dates are disputed on that, maybe 650 BC, maybe 650 AD, we don't know for sure. So Patanjali, the opening line is, yoga consists in the spontaneous stopping of the activity of the mind stuff, the chitta vritti, because it's constantly in motion. As you look around, the thought forms, the chitta in your mind, take on the forms of what you're looking at. So you want to stop that. So the idea is to sit like the Buddha here in perfect stance and imagine a pond with ripples on the pond. You want that pond to stop rippling. It's as though you've thrown a rock into it. Okay, now get it to stop rippling. So it forms a perfect mirror of the sky and the mountains and the trees around it, and you can see down through it. That's the goal in India of yoga. China, he says, on the other hand, likes the ripples. China wants to ride those ripples. Despite the fact that Buddhism was exported in the 1st century AD to China, it was a pseudomorphosis, as Spengler would call it. And the idea, the cosmic idea, is, of course, the yin-yang. And here is a slightly more sophisticated model of the yin-yang. The yin-yang, Campbell says, is equivalent to Dharma in India. It's a cosmic structuring principle that holds everything in its place. But I think it's a little different because it's in much more dynamic motion. The white part of it is the yang, which is masculine and dry. And it refers to originally to the bright side of a bank, of a river bank. The shady side is the yin side, which is dark, has to do with the nighttime, has to do with the negative, the feminine, but they're always in interaction with each other. And this is why this line here, Marcel Grenet points this out, there's a line here that goes up and forms another yin-yang symbol holonomically. So, and down here, there's other action going on as well, because yin-yang isn't a simple thing. It's everything. It's in everything. It causes everything. And the idea is to figure out which way it wants to go and then go with it. Don't fight it. It's not the intentional stopping of the mind stuff. It's getting on the mind stuff and riding it and see where it takes us. As in this figure here from Lao Tzu. Now, this is the primary figure. Lao Tzu with a smile on his face, eyes open. The statues on all Indian art are closed. The world to them is a dream. It's an illusion. They'd rather not be here. Not so for the Chinese. I think the Chinese enjoy the world And here is Lao Tzu riding on the back of a bull or a cow or whatever it is, and having a good time, waiting to see what's going to unfold. What's he going to find? What's the Tao going to show him? So contrast that image with the image of the Buddha. Stasis, complete stasis. All right. So now in the West, we have also a myth of the androgyne, not just in the Bible, but the Greeks had it too. Plato has it in the Symposium. And originally the myth goes that, and I love how Plato always prefaces his myths by saying, well, either this or something like it happened. He always leaves room for ambiguity. Humans were too powerful because they were one being. They had 4 arms, 4 legs, 2 sets of genitals, 2 brains. They were just too powerful, and they frightened the gods. So the gods then split them in half, which is why they seek reunion, men and women, or men and men, or women and women, whatever the sexual orientation happens to be. The Greeks didn't care. But that's the reason why there's a gravitational pull for opposite sexes, or people who love each other. It's eros. It pulls them together, and the gods are afraid of that. So there's a fear in the West of the power of humans, and rightly so, because look what we've done with all of our technology. And so it's due to this guy, Prometheus. Prometheus then becomes the primary signature now, the signature of rebellion against authority. In Aeschylus's play, Prometheus Bound, he says to Zeus, Zeus can do as he likes. I could care less about him. Basically, fuck him. I am bringing technology to humans so that they can build civilization. So, in contrast to the Magian world, and here's the last image that I'll show, is this pathetic image of Job. Job submits. The Christian, the Levantine, as Campbell calls it, and Magian, as Spangler calls it, is based on submission. Job has to end up submitting to God. That's just what happens in that. Islam means submission to God. God is the ultimate authority, and you do not question God. And but Jung comes along, and I like the irony that he comes along near the end of his career and writes Answer to Job, where he changes this myth and gives it this irony that, well, actually, God's temper tantrum in getting Job to submit by showing him his powers is the result of doubts on God about his victory. He knows he may have won the physical battle, let's say, the display of force majeure, but he's morally lost the argument, and he knows it. So the answer to Job will have to be to incarnate as Christ and suffer the way he made Job suffer. That becomes Jung's version of the Answer to Job, which I think is quite beautiful, one of his best books. All right, so we have the signatures then of the 4 great domains. We have Job for the Magian. We have Prometheus. We have Prometheus for the West, and we have Lao Tzu wandering with wide open, looking for a new adventure for China, and then we have the world as a dream with the eyes closed in India. So those are the 4 signatures of the 4 great domains that Campbell opens this wonderful book with. So then we'll continue from there with the next chapter. And don't forget, if you like the video, to hit my like button. It just helps the algorithm and helps it get the video better known. So, all right, that's it for that video.